Let's look at why it's important to shoot RAW if you have the option. Well, I shot this in Yosemite National Park on a small EOS M camera, and unfortunately the sky is blown out. If I add a levels adjustment to try to rescue it and have a look at the histogram, I can see in the histogram that I've got the highlights disappearing off the edge of the side, and no matter how much I bring up the midtones, even if I trash the rest of the image, I've got nothing to bring back in most of the sky. And it's posterized up there too. Now there's just one thing, and that's the dynamic range, which you can get from JPEG as opposed to the dynamic range you'd get in RAW. Now if I was to open the RAW version of that file, because as luck would have it, I did in fact shoot it in both, Photoshop will open it up in the Camera Raw module. Now there's several different ways I can try to rescue this image, and it's before you get to the main Photoshop interface. I could start by darkening the exposure, and if you do that, you'll see that all of the detail in the clouds in the sky are actually there. The sensor could see them, but JPEG couldn't record them. I'm going to set it back to default, and more powerful in this case would be to simply drag the highlights down and then just a little bit of exposure, and maybe push the shadows up a little bit to start from a nice flat place. So access to Camera Raw, and the fact that it was recorded in RAW in the first place, will give you much better dynamic range if the shot was a challenging one. Now, a good habit to get into is to hold Shift as you click the Open Image button and it becomes Open Object. We'll see why smart objects are important later, but the short version is that it lets you revisit this Camera Raw dialog later on. Okay, so I've got a RAW image, which looks much better than the JPEG did. What else is different though? Well, if I zoom right in to the detail in the middle of the image, that's on the RAW image there, and then the same spot on the JPEG and compare them, the JPEG is missing some of the finer detail in the RAW. So in areas like this, the JPEG is lacking compared to the RAW. In other areas like this one, I've got a high contrast edge, and in the JPEG version, you can see that it's slightly over sharpened and there's a little area of halo, a little bit of super bright white highlight there. You can see another area here in the JPEG, which is probably more prominent. If I zoom in one more time on both of those, you'll see that on the RAW, it's far less noticeable than on the JPEG. You'll also get a lot more detail in the areas with less contrast, like this. Any areas which have relatively low contrast runs the risk of being overly compressed in the JPEG. That's not to say that JPEG is inherently bad, and indeed if you're on holiday you may choose to shoot JPEG knowing its limitations simply because it takes up so much less space than RAW, and if you've got limited storage space on holiday, then maybe you choose to shoot JPEG at least once in a while. Dynamic range then, sharpness, detail, and compression artifacts are all much better in RAW. You'll have more control, you'll be able to rescue shots that were otherwise lost in JPEG, and you'll be able to produce a higher quality image. Let's look at how to work non-destructively.